Number two, they say that Zayd bin Thabit forgot to put 2 verses in the Quran. So that means that the Quran is missing 2 verses. And of course they're referring to chapter 9, verse 128. Verily there has come unto you an apostle from amongst yourselves, until the end of the verses. And the second verse is Surah Al-Ahzab, chapter 33, verse 23. Amongst the believers are men who have been true in their covenant with Allah. These verses are found in the Quran right now. So if you open the Quran, you'll find these verses exactly where I quoted them. So what is the story behind these verses? Zayd bin Thabit, as he quotes in Bukhari, volume 6, book 61, number 509, where he talks about the collection of the Quran and how he got it from different people, from the hearts of men and from what was written on stone. Basically collected it from all over and didn't collect it from a specific source, even though he had it completely collected and other companions had it completely collected. So the requirements were that 2 people witness for that verse, for the verse that they're presenting. They need 2 witnesses, and they have to have them both written down, as we mentioned before, not including Zayd bin Thabit, because he was acting as a judge, not acting as the provider of the Quran. And Zayd says in the Hadith, till I found the verse of Surah Tawbah with Abu Khuzama al-Ansari, and I didn't find it with anybody else. And that verse is, verily there has come unto you an apostle, until the end of the verse. So Zayd accepted that verse from him, even though he was one person that presented it and had it written down and memorized it basically at the same time. So they asked, the Christians asked, why then did he accept from Abu Khuzama al-Ansari when he was one man? The answer is, the Prophet, peace be upon him, says in the Hadith, the testimony of Abu Khuzama al-Ansari is equal to 2 men. He was the only person that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said about, that I can recall, said about that his testimony is equal to 2 men. And this is mentioned in Sunan Abu Dawood in the section of judgments. And then the other verse, Al-Ahzab, chapter 33, verse 23, amongst the believers are men who have been true in their covenant with Allah, until the end of the verses, is as simple as this. Zayd said, a verse from Surah Al-Ahzab was missed by me when we copied the Quran. So this was at the time of copying the Quran. So he said, and I used to hear it from Allah's apostle until I found it, and I searched for it until I found it with Khuzama bin Thabit al-Ansari. This was at the time of Uthman, when they copied the Quran. And that can only prove one thing, that in both cases Zayd knew the existence of these verses, or else why would he go searching for them, Mr. Christian? And again, because a lot of companions had memorized the Quran, but very few of them had compiled the Quran and all of the Quran at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So this is the second question answered. The third question is, they also say, they never ask, they just make up their own illusions. They say Zayd bin Thabit disputed with the companions about the Quran, like Umar ibn Khattab, who came to him with a verse, but Zayd didn't accept his verse because he was only one man. Too funny. This is very funny. Now we know where they got their allegation from. It's from the Hadith of Ibn Ashtat. He said that Al-Layth bin Sa'd said Umar ibn Khattab came with a verse of stoning, but Zayd did not accept him because he was alone. Now the question is this hadith authentic? The answer is no. In addition to this, as I said before, it was narrated by Ibn Ashtat from Layth bin Sa'd. Now how is it possible that Layth bin Sa'd, who was born in the 94th year of Hijrah and died in the 175th year, to meet a companion of the Prophet? Where? In his dream? So he could narrate off him? But of course we're used to the Christians getting us fabricated and weak hadith and using them as evidence. Now, on the other hand, we do have hadith that tell the story otherwise. If we look at the book of As-Silsila As-Sahiha, the authentic collection, the book that's called the authentic collection, I'll have the page number and the number of the hadith on the screen there. And this was at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and also narrated by Zayd bin Thabit himself. So let's hear what Zayd has to say. Zayd said, we used to read the old man and the old woman, al-shaykh wa shaykha. Then Marwan said, shouldn't we write it down as part of the Quran, as part of the written Quran? Zayd replied, you see that the two young married are to be stoned. And Umar was with us when we were talking about this matter, may God be pleased with him, and said, I will get you the answer. So we both said, how? He said, from the Prophet, peace be upon him, I will mention such and such to him, and when I get to the verse of stoning, I will say, O Prophet of Allah, allow me to write this verse in the Quran, the verse of stoning. And so Umar said, I went to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and mentioned it, and told him about the verse of stoning, and asked the Prophet, peace be upon him, to let me write the verse of stoning. He said, I can't. Now, why can't the Prophet, peace be upon him, allow this? Again, it's because it is abrogated, dear Christian. And you know what? There is a similar hadith to this in the book of Umar's collection, and I'll also have it written down on the screen there for you. And it is like this one, specified as authentic. Next question, number 4. And I've already destroyed the next question or the next allegation of the Christians, but I will answer it anyhow. They bring a hadith from the collection of Abu Dawood and say, look at Umar, how he was trying to add verses in the Quran when he was the Khalifa or the Caliph, and that was missing from the Quran, as they claim. And yes, it is in an authentic hadith in the collection of Abu Dawood, in the section, I think, of punishment or judgment, and it's narrated by Ibn Abbas. He said that Umar said, may God be pleased with them both, quote, Allah has sent his apostle with truth, meaning the Sunnah. And I'll explain that later. Allah has sent his prophet with truth, and he sent down upon him the book, the Quran. And it was part of what was brought down on him, the verses of stoning. We understood it, and we were aware of his command, and the Prophet stoned, and we stoned after him. And I feel that with time passing by, a person would come and say, we don't find the verse of stoning in Allah's book. So they would go astray by leaving its command. By leaving its command that Allah has sent, and stoning, as we know, is a command for those who commit fornication of the women and the men if they are married, and if the proof is clear, and or the testimony or the confession. And by Allah, if it wasn't for the people saying Umar added things in the book of Allah, I would have wrote it down. So I already answered this in the previous hadith, the authentic hadith that I presented, that Umar was 100% clear and aware that these verses are not part of the Quran anymore. And that's when Umar asked the Prophet, peace be upon him, permission to write these verses down at the time of the Prophet, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, I can't. So why did Umar say this when he was 100% clear that the verse was abrogated, as it says in the hadith of Zayd that I mentioned before this? The answer is, the hadith found in a collection of Abu Dawood, which is the one I just presented right now, is found, I think, in judgment, or a section of punishment or judgment, and it was a part of the sermon given by Umar at the time of his khilafah, at the time of his ruling. And this is found, that speech is found in Al-Bukhari. But why, Mr. Christian, would you go to Abu Dawood and get parts of it when you can get the full version of the hadith in Bukhari by Ibn Abbas. Maybe the Christians don't know that we know about this, or we figured that out. Now I will briefly address the sermon of Umar and show you what Umar meant by his sermon, and I will read parts of it to you. I won't read the whole thing because it's very, very long, and if anybody wants it, I could email it to him, or maybe I'll just have it on the screen there. I'll have a link for it. In the hadith it says,